Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome to the second ever Make Supply video tutorial. We were on a bit of a hiatus there. It's been well over a year since the first one, and we're looking to get down to business and make these things more consistent. So just before we get into the actual tutorial, just wanted to thank everyone for, until this day, still subscribing and emailing comments and questions and all kind of interaction, and we haven't even been doing anything, so that's really cool. Alright, so let's get down to business. If you are looking at this on YouTube and you need the pattern for this, you can go to the link that is below in the comments, and you can download this pattern for free. It prints out on the 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, recommended on cardstock, and you can follow along. It's a little bit of a preview of what we'll be making. Just a simple one pocket card holder. It's a beginner to intermediate level, but we invite anyone to watch and join along. Thanks for watching. Alright, so let's look at the tools we're going to use today to do this card holder. Everything that we'll be using is on this mat right now. So first is the template. I printed this out on 110 pound cardstock from Staples. It's a pretty good option. If you can find heavier, the heavier the better. Number 2 X-Acto knife. Wing divider. I use this instead of an edge groover. I just like the way it feels. It's personal preference, so you can use this or an edge groover. Diamond stitching chisels from Tandy. These are the 2mm versions. I have the 4-prong and 2. Wood slicker. Edge beveler. CS Osborne scratch awl. A block of wax and some stitching needles from Tandy. Some Pro Bond Advanced Elmer's glue. I like to try a lot of different glues. This stuff, it works okay, but I probably won't buy this again. And 2 pieces of sandpaper for cleaning up edges. This is a 120 grit and a 240 grit. And the thread that we'll be using, which is wax cord from Main Thread. This is the .040 weight. It's a little bit thicker, but I think it looks good as a finished product. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is cut out the shapes on the template. Alright, so I cut out the pattern using my X-Acto knife, and I am left with these 2 pieces here. Just a head tip, when you're cutting these out, try to be as accurate as possible at this step. Paper is a lot cheaper than leather, and just if you mess up, just print another one. Really take your time and cut these out accurately. The more accurate you cut at this stage, the more accurate your tracing will be, and then it just builds from there. So I'm going to be using a piece of Tandy Stone Oil Tan. That's about 4 ounces. You can use whatever you want. I would suggest using a veg tan. It'll be a lot easier in the edge finishing process. But this is what I have right now, and this is what I will be using. Alright, so you'll want to line up your pieces onto your leather and trace them out. So we'll do that now. I'm going to be using the CS Osborne scratch awl. Put decent pressure on it, not enough that you're going to bend the template, but enough that you get a good groove around the template. Alright, it's one. And that's the second piece. Alright, from here, take our knife and our straight edge, and we will cut this out. Alright, I had to go get a nice coffee, so back to action. Let's cut this thing out. Even though these have rounded corners, I like to cut straight. You know, any part that has a straight line, I always use, no matter how short or long, I always use the straight edge. So what I'll do is I will cut all the straight lines first and then go back and take off the corners. A little extra light. Alright, so as you can see, I cut that all. It's a square right now, or a rectangle, sorry. And now I'm going to cut off the bottom corners. Kind of annoying because there's a really bad shadow right here. When you're cutting your corners, when you're rounding your corners, you don't have to be perfect. You can always clean it up with the sandpaper, which is what I will do after I finish cutting this out. Definitely be mindful at your starting point when cutting out this inside piece so you don't cut through into the body. Okay, this part's a little difficult. Okay, now my two pieces are cut out. I'll probably, I'll clean these up a little bit first. It's usually best to clean up the rounded edges when they are glued together so it's even on both sides. But this one's a little rough because I did it so quickly. is a lot easier when you're using veg tan. This oil tan just, it's very soft and moves around a lot. Okay, so that's good enough for now. And next step will be to finish the inside edges because we won't have access to them once this is stitched up. So let's do that now. Alright, so let's finish these inside edges. Really wishing I did this in veg tan because oil tan edges are really annoying to burnish. So let's see what we can do. Normally you would take a little bit of water, you would dampen this edge here and this edge here, and you could put some saddle soap on it or some gum trag and burnish it with your wood slicker, and with veg tan it shines up real quickly. This does not work like that with oil tan. So I'm going to take a little bit of water, just a little thing of water I have here. Just put a tiny bit on here. I think most people, when they're making things out of oil tan, they don't really pay attention to the edges that much for this reason. Alright, so a little bit of water there. Just a tiny bit. Get it damp. And then I'll use my beeswax. With this oil tan stuff, the more beeswax, the better. With regular veg tan, you don't really need to do as much. Take your wood slicker and just should shine up a tiny bit, but yeah, this isn't the best for this, so I'm just gonna breeze through this part a little bit. You get the idea. You need to finish, however you finish your edges, you need to do that at this point, because once this is stitched together, it's really, really hard to access the edge. Alright, so that's good enough for now. And also, just as a little detail, I'm gonna round off the inside corner here just so it's not as boxy. Later on, once it's stitched up, I'm also going to round off this outside corner a little bit, just so it gives it a nicer shape. So just going to nick this with the knife. Just take off a tiny bit. Gives it more of like an aerodynamic look. It's probably a terrible analogy. Alright. So that'll do for now. Alright, so our next step will be to glue these pieces together. Alright, so let's glue this thing up here. Grab your glue. I'm using this stuff. You don't want to use too much glue, just enough. The glue isn't to hold anything, once it's put together. It's just to keep it together while you are stitching it. So you always want a very light amount. And this glue is the absolute worst. Got clogged and now it just doesn't come out. Great. Alright, so now I'm making a complete mess. This is great. The perils of making things out of leather. Alright, so that's way more than I would suggest you put on, but my glue sucks, so I'm gonna have to deal with it. It's everywhere. Alright, let's put this thing together. Put a little hand pressure on it, make sure it's nice and as even as possible on both sides, on all three sides. That looks pretty good. You can always clean it up a tiny bit, but you don't want one side hanging off, you know, way more than the other, obviously. Squeeze this. If you have, you know, binder clips or whatever, you can put them on now to hold this while it dries. And wipe away this excess glue. Alright, still everywhere. Alright, so that is put together. I'm going to let that sit for a couple minutes and then come back and we will mark our stitching groove and mark our holes and get this thing stitched up. Alright, so I let that sit for a couple minutes and now we will get to groove in on this thing. So first I usually take a rough grit sandpaper and even this out a little bit. You know, if one piece was a tiny bit bigger than the other, it's going to overhang a tiny bit, and the flatter you get at this stage, you know, the more accurate your groove will be, and then the more accurate it'll be, you know, when you're using the awl or the diamond chisels to go through it. The problems come when one part is overhanging further than the other, because then, you know, it looks good on your front side, but then on the back it's uneven. So just take some sandpaper, you know, even this out. Hopefully there's not too much of a variance. Alright, you know, just check it out. It's nice and flat. Looks pretty good. This side's a little off, but that's okay. Alright, so now that you've sanded this flat, take your edge groover or the wing divider, which is what I'm using. I'm using the standard, you know, 1/8 inch from the edge marking. So start at the top and make your mark. You can go over it a couple times to get a good imprint. I use the wing. This is a step where I use the wing divider because I don't like a deep groove that the groover makes on this type of leather, because those groovers are made for a heavier weight leather, like for a knife sheath or a bag or something. This is very thin leather, and if you're putting a deep groove into this, you know, you're cutting almost halfway through one layer of it already. So I use this just to mark a tiny little groove, and it works out fine. A good tip if you're new to this is also to put a groove on the back, because then as you are, you know, making your holes either with the awl or the diamond chisels, you can see how it's lining up. So a light groove on the back. Alright. Alright, from here we will be ready to mark our holes out. Alright, so let's mark our holes with the diamond chisels. You've seen the other video I made. I explain how I like to start from an even point at the top and then have them meet somewhere in it, just for, you know, a nice even starting point on both sides. So, because unless you have your templates measured out exactly to the distance between these holes, you know, it's gonna be a little bit different. You know, you might start at a perfect spot here, and by the time you get over here, it might be way off. So I like to start from a nice even point on both sides, have them both, you know, start down both sides, and then meet somewhere in the middle. So we'll do that now. I usually overhang the last point right at the edge here. It gives me a good starting point on these sides, and just mark with hand pressure. I'll do hand pressure around from both sides just to get a good idea of what I'm working with, and then I will go through with the mallet and actually put the holes in. Alright, so I'll do my hand pressure. You just put the last diamond into the last hole you made there, and then just keep going. Follow the line. When you get to the curve, you have to go to the 2-prong one. Just work your way around that edge there. And usually at this point, once I get around the edge to the bottom, I'll start on the other side. Overhang, make a little mark. Okay, to the edge, the other one. And I'm around the corner, so go back to the 4-prong. And usually with this, I'll kind of do like 1 or 2 on this side, switch it over, start from the other hole, and mark. And this is where you find out how close you are. So this one, this doesn't quite match up, but that's okay. It won't be too bad. So the one stitch down in the middle here will be a tiny bit longer than the other stitches. Once you start doing your own templates, you can, and you're using diamond chisels, you mark off, you go by the distance of, the distance between here, and you make your templates that way. And every starting point, it's all perfect. Alright, so put one there. Okay. So we went around everywhere on the front, and now we are ready to go through and hammer through all these. I'm going to take this to a different location to hammer because this table is super wobbly and I'm expecting it to fall apart anytime soon. So let me go do that, and I will come back with the holes punched. Okay, so I went ahead and punched the holes all the way through on both sides. Now's a good time. You can kind of look over, how straight your your hole work is. It's a good time to take inventory of where you might need to pay more attention. Like, I always used to have problems going around the edge where it would look good here, but it would be way off line here. So this is where having that other line is very helpful. You can kind of gauge your, what your tendency is when you're holding the diamond chisels. But anyway, let's continue on. So we'll now get ready for stitching. Going to take this main thread, and I usually do a little bit more than 4 times the amount of the circumference. So roughly there. And then usually like a tiny bit more. Alright. Just double check that. I might have cut it at 3. Okay, no, we're good. Alright, take some needles. Insert your needle. Alright, ready to go. I'm going to stitch this off camera. I plan on doing a full saddle stitching video, but that's not for this tutorial. So let me stitch this up and I will come back. Okay, so I just finished stitching that, and being that I didn't show any of the stitching on there, I'll kind of see if I can go over what I did. Just trying to look at this on the camera. So what I did was I started at the very first hole, and then I went backwards one and looped around the top. This style isn't for everybody, but I like the way it looks. It's kind of like a tie off at the top. So what you would do is start at that hole, wrap around the back, and come back through the same hole, and then start your stitch. And you saddle stitch all the way around, and you come to the other end, and then you do the same thing. At the very end, you go through, you wrap around the back, and then you back stitch twice and pull the last part out on the you want both of them to end on the other side, and then cut them here. So that's what I did for my stitching. Now we will go into the edge finishing. So normally I'll go back to my rough grit sandpaper and hit these edges a little bit. You can be a little bit more forceful with it now that it's all stitched together. I always, with the rough grit sandpaper, you can kind of go more aggressive, but as I go to the finer grits, I'll start to only do it in one direction, just to kind of sit down, any of the fibers. So this is, in an effort to compact the edge a little bit, so it'll take the edge beveler better. This oil tan stuff, again, not the best idea to do a tutorial with oil tan. So try to do as good as we can here. Alright, so sanded that with the rough grit, and now I'll put a tiny bit of moisture on here. And hit it with a finer grit. Again, all I'm doing in this step is compressing the fibers in this edge down a little bit, so one, it pushes up the lip a little bit and makes it an easier target for the edge beveler. Okay, that should be good. Alright, take my edge beveler. This is where did I get this? I got this from the Goods Japan website. This is, I think, a number 1. It's whatever the smallest one is. I don't like a very large bevel. I like a finer bevel, and then really working it in the burnishing process. So this is like the smallest one I found. All right. So hopefully all that work with the sanding, makes this part a little bit easier, because all that edge is really compact on there and just picks it right off. Alright, flip it over, do the same on the back. Okay. So now I beveled both sides. I'll usually come back, maybe a tiny bit more moisture on the edge, and then go through again with the finer grit sandpaper, kind of doing like a motion, like a waving motion to hit the beveled edge and just the actual edge. That helps it round out a little bit more. Okay. Because when you're doing that, especially when you apply moisture, you're also already burnishing. So it's just giving you a little bit of a head start. And it helps to fill in, like, sometimes when you burnish, you'll see gaps in your edge. It helps to really seal those up. Alright, so now we will get down to burnishing. Okay, so I'll burnish this as I would burnish a veg tan card holder. So I actually don't like using saddle soap or gum track. I kind of just go with straight water, water and beeswax. So first, get a little bit of moisture on your edge. You'll probably use a little bit more with veg tan than I'm going to use here with this oil tan, because this moisture really doesn't have much of an effect on this oil tan stuff. Alright, get a little bit of water on that. And then use your wood slicker. Find a groove where, there's a couple different sizes, so find the one where you can see it hitting every part of it, because if you go too small, it'll only hit the outside edge and it won't actually hit the top part. So go to the next highest one up and just start slicking this down. It'll shine up real nice with some veg tan. So you keep going through. And this stage, you'll just do this until you get to a point where you are happy. So the veg tan will shine up pretty soon into doing it, and then you just keep going. And at this point, I'll usually go back to a fine grit sandpaper, maybe even finer than the one I have here, and just hit it again really lightly. When you're doing edges is a refining process. The more you repeat your steps, the nicer it's going to be. Kind of like finishing like a wood table or something. You go to the finer grit, and eventually it just starts to look like glass. It's the same with leather. The finer you work the grit, the finer, the more steps you keep going back and burnishing, the nicer it's going to look. So, hit it with the sandpaper again, get a little bit more water, put it on your edge, go back to your slicker. And then once you get to a point where you're happy with the way it's looking, finishing beeswax. I use a little bit more than I would normally use, as I said earlier. Okay. This stuff doesn't burnish very well. And again, if you don't have a wood slicker, you can also use a piece of canvas cloth. Or if you have a Dremel, you can buy the Cocobolo bit. I did a review on that. I still use that thing all the time, but just for the purpose of this video, I'm going to do it by hand. Those things really speed up your time though. Okay, so that'll be good enough for this. So, keep repeating your steps as much as you want. Do a little bit of burnishing, a little bit of fine grit sanding, a little bit more burnishing, a little bit more fine grit sanding, till you get to a point where you're happy with the result. And with this, I'm good with this. So at this point, you're pretty much done. If you want to tack down your stitches, you can do that. I'll just use the edge of this thing. Tapping down like this comes more into play when you're not using a deep groove, and which we're not using the, when we're using the wing divider, there's not a very deep groove for the stitches to sit. So tapping them down, lays a little bit flatter to the leather, less opportunity for the stitch to get snagged on something, but it shouldn't be that big of a deal. It's just going in your pocket, more or less. So let me go find the card. Got a couple credit cards here. Stick them in. Hope you can't read these numbers on this video. Alright, they'll be a little tight at first, but you know, as you use them, it'll make a little bit more space and it'll be fine. So at that point, you're pretty much done. You have a nice little card holder. At this point, okay, well that concludes the card holder build along. I hope it was helpful, and if you have any extra questions, feel free to post them in the blog post comments or in the YouTube video comments. I prefer the blog post comments just because it's easier to deal with. Take a nice up close look. Got a little bit of extra glue on the cover because of that glue problem earlier, but I think we recovered all right. Throw some cards in there, some folded up cash, and you're good to go. Thanks for tuning in.